I don't need any more apologies or begging. Send me the most detailed report on the anti-adultery clause in the trust fund right now.
Fake documents, insurance fraud, conspiracy to alter the trust. Helen Archer was right. This is grand larceny. Get a warrant now.
This is the price for both of your betrayal.
Afternoon light slipped through the lace curtains, painting tangled floral patterns across the dining table like a web. Helen Archer set down the porcelain set she had kept for 3 decades upon the cream tablecloth, her hands trembling slightly, but trying to keep the movements smooth, an old habit, a comforting ritual. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, as if to remind her that the world kept turning, even when something inside her chest seemed to have stopped. The phone on the shelf began to buzz. The screen lit up with a name, Marissa. Helen answered with a practiced smile pressed into her voice, another habit, one used to hide the unease that was already crawling beneath her skin. Marissa, dear, is this a bad time? I was just setting the table for lunch. The silence on the other end made her heart sink. Marissa, the Grant family's younger daughter, the girl Helen had welcomed into their home, always so composed, so proper, was the last person she would ever expect to pull the curtain back in broad daylight. When Marissa finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, trembling, as though every word was being torn from her. Aunt Helen, I don't know where to start. I have to tell you something. A chill ran down Helen's spine. She set the napkin over the back of a chair, forcing calm into her voice. Tell me, darling. Whatever it is, I'm listening. Marissa exhaled shakily, the sound of someone breaking. Lila and Robert, they're together, Aunt Helen. At the cafe on Main Street, I saw them. They were holding each other, kissing. I witnessed it. I couldn't stay silent any longer. The room seemed to darken. Every sound turned heavy, the faint clink of porcelain on the shelf, the rustle of oak leaves outside beating softly against the window pane like fingers on a locked door. What did you say? Helen asked, her voice dry, stripped bare, like it had crossed a season of ice. Marissa began to cry soft, broken sobs. They're planning something. Lila told me she won't let you keep much after the divorce. I heard her laughing with a friend saying everything's already in motion. Aunt Helen, she said, Robert deserves someone younger. She said she'd make sure they'd be free. Each word fell into Helen's heart like stones into water. She looked around the room, every family photo, every teapot, the painting of the old oak in the hallway, all seemed suddenly tinted with a different hue. Humiliation, betrayal. Her face burned. Her throat closed. Perhaps that was what betrayal felt like, not a clean wound, but a hollowing, a slow rot that smelled of deceit. 42 years of marriage, patching roofs together, sleepless nights, nursing their son, Christmas cards from happier years now scattered like dead leaves at her feet. Yet through the shock, something colder began to rise, not fire, but steel. Not the urge to scream, nor the impulse to weep. It was a quiet resolve, solid and sharp. If they meant to take from her her dignity, her family's legacy, they would not do it through noise. She was past the age of screaming. She would fight with her mind, her patience, and the law. Marissa, she said, her voice now calm, too calm. You did the right thing by calling me. Don't say a word about this to anyone, especially Ryan. Let me handle it. Handle it, Marissa stammered. I'm afraid of what they might do, Aunt Helen. They seemed serious. They think they have the right, Helen murmured, eyes fixed on the clock as if counting down. But they don't know the rules of this game. Keep what you know to yourself. If Lila finds out you told me, everything will break, trust me. When she hung up, the silence returned deeper now. Outside, Ashford lay still beneath the autumn light, its calmness only amplifying the pulse in her ears. She could hear her own breathing, her heartbeat like a drum summoning her to battle. She walked slowly toward the window. The garden below shimmered faintly with late sunlight, the white roses she had planted now curling at their edges, their scent turning faintly sour, a perfume that once meant peace, now thick with irony. She thought of Robert's hands trimming those same bushes, years ago, when his laughter filled the air like wind chimes. "They'll outlive us, Helen," he'd said once, smiling. "Everything worth keeping does." The words twisted now, cruel in their echo. She turned away from the window. Her reflection caught her eye in the cabinet glass, the silver hair pinned neatly, the pearls around her neck, the faint traces of a woman who once believed goodness alone could protect her. But that woman was gone. In her place stood something quieter, older, yes, but also shrewder. Helen opened a drawer and pulled out an old leather ledger, the Whittaker family record, kept for generations. She placed her hand on the page, feeling the texture of time beneath her palm, then wrote in a firm, deliberate hand, "No one shall turn the Whittaker inheritance into a feast for their desires." For a moment, she simply watched the ink dry, her breathing steadying, her pulse settling into something cold and certain. A knock came at the front door, soft, tentative. She didn't move. The sound came again, followed by the voice of Mrs. Calloway, the neighbor from 2 houses down. "Mrs. Archer? I brought those apples you wanted for the pie." Helen closed the ledger carefully and slid it back into the drawer. When she opened the door, her smile was perfectly composed. "Thank you, Margaret. You're very kind." The neighbor peered in curiously. "Everything all right, dear? You look a little pale." "I'm fine," Helen said softly. "Just a long morning. Too much thinking." Mrs. Calloway chuckled sympathetically and handed her the small basket. "Don't we all? Well, you take care, Helen. You've always been the strong one around here." Strong. The word echoed long after the door shut. Helen stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the wood. Then, with a quiet exhale, she carried the apples to the kitchen counter and began peeling them one by one. The knife glided through the red skin, ribbons falling in neat curls. The rhythm soothed her, the kind of rhythm one finds in control. Outside, the oak tree shivered in the wind, scattering its last leaves across the path. Strong. Yes, perhaps she had been. But strength, she knew now, was not the absence of pain, it was the ability to use it. As twilight began to gather, she lit the small lamp by the window. The golden light caught the porcelain cups again, glinting across a thin crack in one of them, one she had never noticed before. It ran like a delicate vein from the rim to the center, faint but unmissable now that she'd seen it. She traced it with a fingertip. It wasn't ruin, not yet. It was warning, a fracture before the break. Helen set the cup down and straightened her posture. There was paperwork to review, bank ledgers, trust records, old letters from Robert's attorney. There was a name that came to mind: Caldwell, the man who'd handled the family's estate for 30 years. Discreet, loyal, and too old to play games. She made a note in the margin of the ledger: "Call Caldwell." Quietly, outside, night thickened around Ashford. A dog barked in the distance. The town clock told 6. Helen poured herself another cup of tea and sat back in the hush of her home. The scent of apples and Earl Grey mingled in the air, warm, comforting, but beneath it all lingered another fragrance, faint traces of Lila's perfume. That expensive, syrupy sweetness that had clung to Robert's collar last Sunday when he returned from a drive. It was still there, haunting the air. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. So be it. Let them have their secret meetings, their plans, their whispered promises. Let them believe she was the aging wife, too soft, too gentle to fight back. They didn't know that silence, when wielded properly, could destroy. She looked again at the cracked porcelain, the faint glimmer along its wound. Then she whispered, not to the room, but to the memory of every Whittaker woman before her. "Time is all I need." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn across the lawn. And in the stillness of the house, where betrayal had just taken root, something colder, something relentless began to grow. Evening settled over Ashford like a heavy, rain-scented blanket. The yellow kitchen light wavered against the wall where a faded wedding photograph hung Helen and Robert Archer, young and smiling in a spring meadow, eyes full of hope and trust. 42 years later, and in the hush of this single evening, that photograph looked like a lie preserved in a frame. Helen stood at the stove, ladle in hand, stirring the pot of chicken soup that had simmered since late afternoon. The aroma of rosemary and bay leaf filled the air, mingling with something metallic, the faint tang of fatigue and the bitterness of waiting. Steam rose, fogging her glasses until everything in front of her blurred, the soup, the counter, even the life she'd built. She heard the garage door lift, the mechanical groans slicing through the quiet. Moments later, the slow, measured thud of footsteps crossed the tile floor. Then came the scent. Santal 33, that unmistakable blend of cedar, cardamom, and sandalwood, bold, young, confident, a perfume she had never owned, never liked. The same one she had smelled on Robert's collar last week, when he returned late from meetings. The same scent that had lingered on Lila's scarf when she'd leaned in to kiss Helen's cheek during Sunday dinner. Now it lingered in the kitchen like a ghost, and Helen could feel it crawling across the walls. "Smells good," Robert said, setting down his briefcase. His voice was calm, easy, almost kind. "Long day at work." Helen turned toward him. Her lips shaped the soft, familiar smile that had kept peace in this house for 4 decades, the smile that could conceal almost anything. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Would you like some wine?" He nodded, loosening his tie. His fingers moved with a small, practiced haste. He checked his phone once, a fleeting glance, a flicker of guilt disguised as routine before sliding it into his pocket. Helen noticed. She noticed everything now. For a brief, wild second, she saw herself crossing the kitchen, grabbing him by the collar, shouting the words clawing at her throat. "I know, Robert Archer. I know about the perfume, the lies, the woman young enough to call me aunt." But the vision dissolved as quickly as it came, replaced by the steady rhythm of the ladle scraping the pot. They sat across from each other at the table, the same table they'd bought together in their first year of marriage. The candle between them flickered weakly. Robert filled his plate, said a polite, "Thank you," and began to eat. He spoke of the office, of a new client in Savannah, of traffic on the highway, all the small, safe things that fill a silence too fragile to touch. "Did Ryan call today?" he asked after a pause. Helen nodded. "He's busy, but he's fine." Her voice was calm. Her hand didn't shake. But her gaze steady, detached, studied him like one might study a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house. When Robert rose from the table and headed upstairs to his study, Helen didn't move. She listened to the creak of the floorboards, the closing of his door, and the faint hum of the ceiling fan that always followed. Then the quiet returned, vast, sharp, merciless. The kitchen glowed under the warm light she had always loved, but now it looked sterile, foreign. The gleam of the countertops mocked her. The rows of polished dishes, each one spotless, stood like witnesses in judgment. Even the ticking clock seemed cruel, a slow, deliberate pulse marking the death of something she couldn't yet name. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles blanched. Something swelled in her chest, not tears, not yet, but an ache so deep it bordered on rage. Humiliation, betrayal, the hollow awareness of being replaced, they mixed together like poison in her veins. 42 years of devotion boiled down to this, a man who came home smelling of someone else. The weight of it pressed her down. She sank to the cold tiled floor, back against the cabinet, staring at the empty chair across the table. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. At last, the tears came slow, reluctant, scorching. They weren't the soft tears of sorrow, but the hard kind that carved lines into a woman's strength. She bit her lip until it bled, trying to stifle the sound, unwilling to hear her own heartbreak echo in the quiet house. She thought of the years, the small, invisible things that make up a life, hands brushing in the dark, whispered apologies after arguments, the promise that love was unbreakable. She thought of how Robert had looked at her once, the way he'd held her hand through the years of raising Ryan, the way his voice had steadied her through loss and illness. And now this, a stranger upstairs, sending messages under another name. In the merciless ticking of the clock, Helen counted what she had lost: the pride of a wife, the certainty of being chosen, the quiet dignity of trust. All that remained was a role she no longer believed in: the blind, dutiful wife. Footsteps echoed from above. Robert's voice, polite and distant, drifted down the stairs. "Still cleaning up? You should rest, Helen. You look tired." She lifted her head, forcing a brittle smile. "I'll be up soon." When his shadow vanished, she rose slowly, clearing the plates one by one. Each dish clinked against another with a delicate ting, the brittle music of a life cracking apart. She washed them in silence, her reflection wavering in the water. Her hands moved automatically, soap, rinse, dry, but her mind was somewhere else, moving in circles, tracing every detail she had ignored, every silence she had mistaken for peace. Finally, she opened the back door and stepped out into the cold. The yard stretched before her, silvered with mist. The oak tree stood in the middle, the one they had planted on their 10th anniversary, when love still felt like something that would last forever. Now it was stripped bare, its limbs skeletal against the fog. Helen looked at it for a long time. Then she whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "You've already cut it down inside me, Robert." The wind moved through the branches, rattling them like old bones. She felt it sweep through her hair, through the hollow place inside her chest. And in that hollow, something sparked, small, steady, alive. A single clear thought: if love can be betrayed, honor cannot. If they crush your trust, rebuild it with your mind. She turned back into the kitchen. The light shimmered faintly on the glass cabinet, reflecting her face, pale, drawn but different now. The softness had drained away. What remained was clarity, hard and cold as iron. "I've seen the end," she murmured, a vow taking shape in her voice. "And I'll forge it into steel." Helen blew out the kitchen light. Darkness filled the room, wrapping around her like a cloak, not defeat, but concealment. Somewhere above her, Robert's footsteps moved again, steady, predictable. He believed the world was still his, that his wife was still blind. He was wrong. That night, the first night after betrayal, passed in silence. But in that silence, something began to take root. Not rage, not despair. A plan, a rebirth waiting for dawn. If it were you, after 42 years of marriage, discovering the one you loved most had betrayed you, would you remain silent and observe, or confront it, even knowing it would shatter everything? Comment 1 if you would stay silent to see the truth unfold. Comment 2 if you would confront it and end it immediately. Morning in Ashford was unnervingly calm, the kind of calm that hums beneath the surface, waiting to crack. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains, spreading long pale ribbons across the dining table, light that brushed over Helen Archer's face as she smiled at Robert, the man sitting across from her, pretending to read the newspaper, as if the world they shared hadn't already fractured into silence and lies. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked, his tone smooth, his eyes fixed on the paper. Helen nodded, her movements careful, almost ceremonial. The spoon stirred the sugar, clinking lightly against porcelain. She could hear every sound: the scraping of the chair, the steady tick of the clock, even the faint hum of the refrigerator, as though the world had become painfully precise. Inside her, blood pulsed in quiet rhythm, not chaotic like last night, but measured, controlled. The wild grief had burned itself out. What remained was a core of molten iron cooling into form. Robert's phone buzzed on the table. A small vibration, a flicker of light. "Lila G. Thank you for last night. I'm still shaking." The words glowed against the screen for one merciless second before Robert's hand darted out, flipping the phone face down. His voice, when he spoke, carried a forced lightness, probably just something from work. Group chat. Helen smiled, that same practiced curve of calm that had steadied funerals, soothed clients, saved countless awkward dinners. She knew exactly how to smile without letting it touch her eyes. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the silver teapot beside her. Her eyes were no longer the soft brown of forgiveness. They were still pools of glass, now clear, cold, unblinking. Beneath the calm, her mind was a map, rearranging fragments of betrayal into a pattern. That night, when the house fell silent, Helen moved like a shadow. Robert's snores rose and fell in a rhythm she had once found comforting. Now, it was only noise, the breathing of a man who believed himself untouchable. She slipped into his study. The scent met her immediately, Santal 33, heavy, intimate, intrusive. It clung to the air like guilt itself. On the desk sat his work phone, the one she had never touched. The drawer creaked softly as she pulled it open, revealing the neat stack of bills, pens, and that sleek black device. Her hands didn't tremble, not once. The password, their wedding date. A cruel irony. She entered it. The screen came alive, casting a cold glow across her face, not the face of the woman who had wept on the kitchen floor, but the face of someone reborn through fire. Messages unfolded in a merciless parade. You make me feel alive again. Can't wait to see you. Photos of Lila, her smile calculated, her pose rehearsed. Reservations. Flights. Hidden meetings. The girl had given herself a nickname, Swan. A creature of grace, purity, devotion. Helen almost laughed. Not a swan, she murmured to herself. A vulture in white feathers. She plugged in the small external drive she had bought years ago for family photos. Now it served another purpose. One by one, she copied everything: texts, emails, images, receipts. Each piece slid into the drive like a bullet chambered in silence. When she finished, she restored the room to perfect order. No fingerprints, no disorder, no trace of her intrusion. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway. Her gaze swept over the oak desk, the framed degrees, the family photos, relics of their partnership, of the company they'd built together, brick by brick, contract by contract. He hadn't just betrayed her as a wife, he had violated the architect of his own foundation. Barefoot, she stepped into the corridor. The wood beneath her feet was cold, grounding. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, soft, merciful. The world, it seemed, wanted to cover everything. But Helen didn't want to forget. She wanted to remember every detail. That morning, Robert left early, muttering about meetings. His tie was crooked. He didn't notice her watching him go. When the door clicked shut, Helen stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the sound of his car fade down the drive. Then she exhaled, long and steady, and reached for her notebook. But not yet. She had something else in mind first. That afternoon, she called Lila. Her voice was warm, casual. "Sweetheart, are you free for lunch tomorrow? I've been meaning to catch up." And just like that, the trap was set. The next day, sunlight glowed weakly through the kitchen windows, diffused by the pale winter sky. The table gleamed polished wood, white linen, crystal glasses. "Lila, you look radiant," Helen said as she poured a chilled Sauvignon Blanc. Lila smiled brightly, her skin flawless, her youth glowing in a way that almost hurt to look at. "Oh, thank you, Mother. I've been taking care of myself lately. Work's been hectic, and Ryan, too. We've both been exhausted." Helen tilted her head, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. "We're all tired, darling. But you know, people only grow truly tired when they're living two lives at once." For a fraction of a second, Lila froze. The laughter that followed came just a beat too late. "What a funny thing to say. I only have one life, Mother." Helen raised her glass, her eyes locking onto the younger woman's with quiet precision. "Good," she said. "Because those who live two lives rarely live long." The air thickened. Lila's smile faltered before recovering into something bright, brittle. Helen changed the subject, her voice light. Polite: the garden roses, the weather, the coming frost. But as she set her glass down, sunlight glanced off the blade of the table knife, catching her eye a fleeting flash of steel. That night, after the house fell into its usual hush, Helen began her ritual. She opened a small, navy blue notebook with clean ivory pages and placed it in the back of the pantry, behind the jars of peach preserves. Each line she wrote was exact, her pen gliding steadily. November 10, Santal 33 on Robert's collar, identical to Lila's perfume. November 12, anonymous call, 11:47 p.m. traced to Lila's number. November 14, 2 plane tickets, R.A.&S. G. Ocean View Hotel, Miami. Each entry was a heartbeat. Each date, a brick in the fortress she was building. Her handwriting was unshaken, elegant, deliberate. The rage no longer consumed her. It sustained her. The pain had turned to discipline. When she finished, she stood by the window. Snow blanketed Ashford, turning the world white and silent. The moonlight caught in the frost, scattering shards of cold brilliance across the glass. Helen placed a hand against the pane, her breath forming a faint halo of fog. "Every false smile they share," she whispered, "I'll archive it and return it to them in iron." Her reflection stared back at her, half in shadow, half in light. The woman who once trembled had been replaced by one who calculated. Upstairs, Robert shifted in his sleep, mumbling something into the dark, a dreamer oblivious to the storm beneath his roof. Helen turned from the window, her silhouette slicing across the floor like a blade. She was no longer merely the keeper of the home. She was the keeper of truth, of evidence, of consequence, of justice waiting to strike. And as the snow continued to fall, quiet and pure, Helen Archer's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. By morning, the woman the world had known, kind, soft, trusting, would be gone. In her place stood something forged cold, luminous, and precise as steel. Morning draped a pale mist over downtown Ashford. The streets shimmered faintly with dew, and the sound of passing cars was muffled, distant, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Helen Archer stood before the glass facade of Bennett & Cole, both hands gripping the worn leather strap of her handbag. Inside her chest, what once had been love had calcified into something colder: strategy. She no longer cried. She no longer asked why. Now, every heartbeat was a measured calculation. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, paper, and polished mahogany. The murmur of voices from nearby offices faded as Helen approached the reception desk. A young assistant led her down a narrow corridor lined with framed degrees and awards, silent trophies of battles won in rooms just like this one. Helen immediately recognized Laura Bennett when she entered, a woman in her early 40s, slender, neat, with a kind of confidence that came not from charm, but from precision. Her hair was tied back, her eyes bright and deliberate, the eyes of someone who didn't blink when the truth cut deep. "Mrs. Archer," Laura said, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, her tone brisk but warm enough to steady the room. "I've reviewed the documents you sent. This doesn't look like a typical divorce." Helen sat, her posture straight, her face calm, a portrait of control carved from marble. "It's not," she said. "This isn't a quarrel between spouses. It's a war governed by law. I don't want revenge. I want justice and order restored." Laura opened the folder Helen had brought. The soft rustle of paper filled the quiet room: deeds to the Oak Ridge house, investment statements, letters written in careful cursive decades ago, and finally, a parchment whose edges had yellowed with time. "The Whitaker Family Trust. This trust is quite old," Laura murmured, turning the pages gently. Established, 1948. It's unusual, but solid. And there are heavy restrictions on inheritance rights. Helen's gaze didn't waver. Read Clause 8. Laura found the line, her lips moving silently until her eyes stilled. She looked up, the faintest spark glinting in her expression. In the event that a marriage is dissolved on grounds of adultery, the guilty party shall forfeit all ownership and inheritance rights to any property held under the Whitaker family trust. Laura leaned back slowly, exhaling. That's ironclad, old-fashioned, but legally binding. You have a weapon, Mrs. Archer, one people don't see coming anymore. Helen's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something close. My husband doesn't know the clause exists. He assumes the estate will be divided as usual. But She paused, letting the words settle like a blade unsheathed. I'm only waiting for him to sign. Laura studied her for a long moment. You intend to let him walk right into it? I do. Helen's voice was soft but sharp, the sound of silk hiding steel. I already have everything I need: messages, photographs, timestamps. There's no need for confrontation. I'll let him think I've given up. The trap works best when the prey believes he's already free. The office hummed faintly, the air conditioning, the tick of Laura's pen, the distant whir of a printer. Everything seemed mechanical, methodical, precise. Laura smiled, impressed. You're not planning to fight him. You're planning to erase him. Helen looked at the window, where the reflection of her own face merged with the morning skyline. He erased us first. That night, Ashford was silvered with frost. Streetlights painted long diagonal bars across the living room walls, thin, luminous, like drawn swords. Robert sat in his usual chair, a glass of bourbon in hand, the TV murmuring low. When Helen walked in, he turned slightly, wearing the awkward smile of a man trying to act normal. I was thinking, he began, hesitating as he set the glass down. Maybe we should talk about the future. Helen placed her purse on the armchair, her tone even. The future of you and me, or the future of you and Lila? Robert froze mid-breath. His glass tilted, spilling a thin ribbon of whiskey across his fingers. What are you talking about? Helen stepped closer, her shadows stretching across the floor between them. Her voice was calm, almost tender. If you found your happiness, I won't stand in the way. All I ask is that you sign the papers soon, so we can both move on cleanly. Robert blinked, caught between relief and disbelief. You want a divorce? Helen smiled, faint and weary. You were right. 42 years is long enough. Maybe I've been holding on to something that no longer exists. He straightened, his body relaxing for the first time. Beneath the surface of his words, she caught the faint gleam of satisfaction. I'm glad you see it that way. We can do this quietly, Helen. No need to make it ugly. No lawyers, no fighting. She nodded. Yes, everything will be very civil. To him, her tone meant surrender. To her, it was the soft click of a lock closing. A few days later, Helen returned to Laura's office. This time, sunlight streamed through the blinds, striping the desk with lines of light and shadow. Laura had prepared a new folder, thicker, heavier. We'll let him file first, Laura said, sliding the papers forward. Once he signs the petition, we'll unveil the evidence and trigger the trust clause. The moment adultery is proven, he forfeits everything. The house, the accounts, even the business equity. Helen's fingers brushed the edge of the file. Her nails were immaculate, her hand steady. She began to tap lightly 3 beats, then silenced the rhythm of someone counting moves in a game only she could see. Lila thinks she's clever, Helen said finally, her voice a low hum. She's convinced him I'm too proud to fight, that I'll fade quietly. But what she doesn't understand is that silence isn't surrender. It's the language of those who already hold the knife. Laura laughed softly, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Mrs. Archer, I've represented dozens of betrayed women. I've never seen one handle it with such composure. Helen lifted her teacup, the steam rising like smoke from a slow, controlled fire. She looked out the window, Ashford glittering in the noonlight, so bright and innocent it almost hurt to see. I don't need to scream, she said quietly. I only need to set the rules, and wait for them to break themselves upon them. Laura smiled. Then I suppose all that's left is patience. Helen's gaze flicked back, serene and final. Patience, she said, is just another form of precision. That evening, Helen drove home under a pale sunset. The house was silent, as it always was now. The ticking clock sounded louder against the emptiness. She stopped before the mantel, staring at the wedding photograph, two young faces smiling into the wind, hands intertwined, believing in forever. Her fingers reached out, touching the frame. The glass was cool, unfeeling. You've made your choice, she whispered. And now, I've made mine. The lamplight glowed across her face, calm, regal, unreadable. Not grief anymore, but command. The tremor in her hands was gone. The game board was set. And Helen Archer, the woman who had once collapsed on a cold kitchen floor, now stood like a strategist before battle, composed and unflinching. Outside, the winter wind stirred the last of the leaves. Inside, the air itself seemed to wait. Helen turned off the light, her reflection vanishing into the dark glass, not the reflection of a victim, but of a woman made of quiet vengeance and law-bound steel. If it were you, would you dare pretend to lose, only to win with a final, perfect strike? Comment 3 if you believe true power lies in patience. Comment 4 if you think one should strike back before it's too late. Monday morning, the rain had just passed, leaving the streets of Ashford slick with silver. Helen Archer sat in her car, watching the tall glass tower across the street. Prescott and Hale, attorneys at law. In a few minutes, she would walk into that building and hand her enemies the victory they'd been craving, a gift wrapped in velvet, hiding a blade. She adjusted her hair in the mirror. Her hands did not tremble. Inside her bag lay a neatly folded copy of the Whitaker Family Trust and an external drive containing every piece of evidence from the affair: messages, photos, dates, locations. Helen had learned a truth few ever understood. When your enemies think you're weak, let them keep believing it. The conference room smelled of polished wood, leather, and ambition. William Prescott, Robert's attorney, rose to greet her with a charming, confident smile. Mrs. Archer, he said, extending a hand. I'm so glad you chose a civilized approach. This will be a smooth, peaceful process. Helen smiled faintly. I agree. After 42 years, I no longer have the strength to fight. Robert sat to Prescott's right, poised, self-assured, his face carrying that careful mix of sympathy and fatigue. Beside him, Lila, the woman who once called her mom, wore a cream silk dress and a smile polished to perfection. Helen noticed the younger woman's hand resting on Robert's knee, her thumb brushing lightly, a silent reminder, he's ours now. Prescott slid a thick folder across the table. Here's the final agreement. You'll receive a small apartment in Riverfront District, a reasonable support allowance, and, of course, full retirement benefits. The rest, the house, the company, the assets will belong to Mr. Archer. Helen opened the folder and turned each page slowly, her eyes gliding over the clauses as if she were reading poetry. Each line was a trap, crafted carefully to box her in. And yet, her expression never wavered. It seems fair, she said softly. Robert exhaled, the sound of a man unburdened. I knew you'd choose peace, Helen. We both deserve happiness. Happiness. The word scraped against her heart like a dull blade, not deep enough to kill, but sharp enough to scar. She nodded once. Of course. Everyone deserves happiness, in whatever form they choose. Lila leaned forward, her voice honeyed. I admire your strength, Mother Helen. Not everyone can let go so gracefully. Helen looked at her, smiling gently, the kind of smile that seemed too kind to be real. Thank you, my dear. Sometimes, letting go simply shows us who is really holding on. The air thinned for a brief moment until Prescott cleared his throat, breaking the tension. If there are no objections, please sign here and here. The fountain pen glided across the paper. Each stroke of Helen's name was elegant. Steady Helen Whitaker Archer, a name that carried the blood, pride, and law of a family Robert had forgotten he merely married into. As the ink dried, Prescott smiled, closing the folder with a soft click. Excellent. I'll file this first thing tomorrow. In 60 days, everything will be finalized. Helen set the pen down. 60 days. A beautiful number. Robert stood, walking around the table. You've done the right thing, Helen. I always knew you would. She looked up at him, her expression calm, unreadable. I've always done the right thing, Robert. You just never noticed. They left the conference room radiant with relief. Robert's hand slid around Lila's waist as they stepped toward the elevator. Lila leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, her smile triumphant, a queen claiming her throne. Prescott, lingering behind, shook Helen's hand warmly. You won't regret this, Mrs. Archer. Helen tilted her head, her voice soft, almost tender. I know. Not for a moment. The elevator doors closed, sealing them away, the husband, the mistress, the lawyer, all glowing with premature victory. Helen remained alone in the marble corridor. Her reflection shimmered on the polished floor, a small, composed woman in a pale coat, elegant and still. But in her eyes, something glinted, the cold, cutting gleam of tempered steel. I sign, she whispered, her smile slow and deliberate, and they celebrate. They have no idea this signature is the noose tightening. At home, the rain returned. Helen poured herself a glass of red wine and sat by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass like threads of time. She lifted the wine, the deep crimson liquid catching the lamplight, glowing like blood. She began to count silently. 60 days. 60 days for the trap to close. 60 days until the Whitaker law awakened and claimed its debt. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Laura Bennett lit the screen. Everything's ready. Once they file the paperwork, I'll trigger the trust clause. Prepare for the final act. Helen placed the phone beside her and raised her glass again. The reflection of the wine shimmered in her eyes, calm, ruthless, deliberate. Outside, wind swept through the oak trees, scattering the last yellow leaves across the rain-slick yard. Inside the old Whitaker house, a betrayed woman sat in silence, drinking to the storm she had built with her own hands, a storm that would soon consume those who thought they'd already won. Tuesday morning, Ashford was wrapped in fog, a thick, silvery veil that blurred the world into silence. The air smelled of rain and cold iron. Helen Archer was watering the rose bushes outside the porch, her motion steady, almost meditative. The faint drip of water, hitting wet soil, blended with the rustle of leaves. It was a quiet morning until the hum of an engine broke the stillness. A silver sedan stopped at the gate. Ryan stepped out first, his hair unkempt, his shoulders rigid, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Behind him was Marissa, pale and trembling, her eyes red from tears, clutching a folder like it might disappear if she let go. Helen. Ryan's voice cracked. We need to talk. Right now. Helen set the watering can down, wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The kind of look on her son's face only came when something irreparable had been found. Come inside, she said quietly. You both look like ghosts. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee, but beneath it lingered something heavier, dread. Helen poured 3 cups, set them down, and waited. Ryan pushed the folder toward her. His fingers shook slightly. I found this in Lila's safe. She left it unlocked when she was packing. You need to see it. Helen opened it. The papers inside were cold, clinical copies of financial contracts, property records, and, near the bottom, a life insurance policy. Her name printed neatly at the top, Helen Whitaker Archer. The beneficiary, Lila Grant. At the bottom was her signature. Perfectly forged, Helen's voice was soft but sharp. She forged my name? Marissa nodded quickly. I called the insurance company myself. There's no record of you filing anything. They confirmed this was falsified, and there's more. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. On her laptop, she said, her voice trembling. I found emails between Lila and a private investigator. She paid him to research the Whitaker family trust looking for a way to void the adultery clause. She wanted to break it, so she could take everything. Silence settled like ice. Ryan gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. She told me you were the one destroying Dad. That you wanted revenge. But she's the one who's been planning this. She forged your name. She wanted the house. The company. She wanted you gone. Helen didn't speak for a long moment. Her gaze lingered on the papers, on her own name twisted into a weapon. The betrayal had crossed the line from sin into crime. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate. We won't raise our voices. We won't confront them. This has passed beyond emotion. Let the law speak now. Marissa unlocked her phone with shaking hands. I already called a friend from Hartford County Detective Marcus Reyes. He said he'd meet us this afternoon. Helen's expression softened, just slightly pride flickering behind the steel in her eyes. Good, she said. It's time justice knocked on the Whitaker door. That afternoon, the fog had thinned into a pale mist. The three of them sat in a small conference room at the Ashford Police Department. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. The air was cool, sterile, professional. Detective Reyes entered tall, solid, a man who carried silence like a second skin. He greeted them with a nod, his eyes scanning Helen with the calm curiosity of someone who already suspected he was standing in front of the real architect of the story. Mrs. Archer, he said as he set down his notebook. Miss Bennett has briefed me. Your case is rather remarkable. Ryan started from the beginning: the affair, the deceit, the trap, the forged documents. His voice cracked when he spoke of how easily he had believed Lila's lies. Marissa filled in the rest, explaining the USB, the emails, the insurance policy. Reyes didn't interrupt. His pen moved slowly across the page, each note deliberate. When they finished, he flipped through the papers, scanning every line, his brows knitting. Forgery, he murmured. Insurance fraud. Unauthorized investigation into a protected trust. He paused, then looked up, eyes hardening. And emails suggesting intent to harm. He closed the folder with a quiet, definitive sound. This isn't just deception, Mrs. Archer. It's a criminal conspiracy. At minimum, we're looking at identity theft and insurance fraud. But if intent can be proven, he leaned forward slightly. This could qualify as attempted murder. Ryan froze. Marissa inhaled sharply. Helen, however, only nodded once, a small, measured motion. Reyes studied her face. Mrs. Archer, are you prepared to cooperate fully? Helen's lips curved into something almost like a smile, not joy, but resolution. Detective, she said softly, I've been waiting for that question for 60 days. The next morning dawned cold and bright. The fog had lifted, leaving the lakefront glistening under the pale sun. By mid-morning, a search warrant was signed. 2 officers accompanied Detective Reyes to the villa Robert and Lila had recently rented by the water. When the door opened, Lila stood frozen in the foyer, still in her nightgown, hair tangled, face drained of all color. Behind her, half-packed suitcases lined the floor. Miss Grant, Reyes said, his tone even and formal, holding up the warrant. We're here regarding falsified insurance documents and assets related to the Whitaker family trust. From the kitchen, Robert emerged, his face pale. There must be some mistake, he stammered. Everything we've done is legal. Reyes didn't blink. Mr. Archer, when an insurance policy appears with your ex-wife's forged signature and your mistress as the beneficiary, we call that fraud, not legality. Lila stepped back, her voice thin. I don't know what you mean. Maybe someone Reyes cut her off, sliding printed emails onto the coffee table. And these messages to your private investigator? The ones where you wrote, "We need to remove Helen before the trust activates"? Was that someone else too? The silence that followed was suffocating. Robert turned to her, his expression collapsing into horror. Lila, what did you do? Lila's lips trembled. Tears came, fast and shallow. I didn't mean, I just thought, but her voice faltered. The truth was already written across her face. From the doorway, unseen, Helen watched. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She simply observed, calm, composed, like a witness watching the final act of a long play she had written herself. There was no gloating in her eyes, only an unshakable stillness. Justice, finally, was breathing. That night, the Archer house glowed softly beneath the moon. The rose garden shimmered under a veil of dew. Helen stood by the window, her reflection caught between shadow and silver light. Her phone buzzed. A message from Detective Reyes lit the screen. Arrest warrants executed. Thank you for your patience and your precision. Justice has been served properly. Helen set the phone down beside a half-filled glass of red wine. She raised the glass to the moonlight, the liquid glowing like dark garnet. In the reflection, she saw herself not broken, not bitter, but whole again. Those who had mocked her had stepped willingly into her web. The fake signatures, the emails, the deceit, all the pieces they had used to trap her had become the net that closed around them. On her desk, the blue leather notebook lay open. On its final page, in bold, deliberate handwriting, one line stood out. Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs the right moment. Helen closed the notebook with care, exhaled slowly, and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the wind rustled through the oaks, whispering through the leaves a quiet victory song, composed not of rage, but of balance restored. For the first time in months, Helen smiled not out of vengeance, but peace. If it were you when justice finally stood on your side, would you forgive those who tried to destroy you, or let them face the full weight of their choices? Comment 5 if you'd choose forgiveness for your own peace. Comment 6 if you'd let the law and truth deliver its verdict. That afternoon, the sky above Ashford hung heavy with clouds. The air felt thick, waiting for a storm to break. Helen Archer stood by the window, a cup of tea steaming between her hands. Beyond the glass, a black Mercedes turned slowly into the driveway, its tires cutting through puddles along the rain-soaked rose bushes. "They're here," she murmured, not turning. In the living room behind her, Ryan and Marissa sat in tense silence. Ever since the indictment, Helen hadn't seen Robert. But she knew this day would come, the day they would face each other without lawyers, without papers, on the very ground that had once been their home. The car stopped. Robert stepped out first, his expensive suit drenched, his face pale and drawn. Behind him came Lila, beige coat clinging to her, sunglasses hiding half her face. Two uniformed officers emerged from a patrol car nearby, standing quietly at a distance. Helen opened the door. Rain splashed against the old stone porch, carrying the scent of earth and rust. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone calm, almost gentle, the kind of gentleness that made Robert falter. I need to talk," he said, his voice uneven. "The court hasn't ruled yet. Maybe we can still settle things." "Settle?" Helen raised an eyebrow. "You mean negotiate after she forged my signature, took out an insurance policy in my name, and plotted to remove me?" Lila's voice sliced through the air, sharp and brittle. "I didn't hurt anyone. Those papers, they're your lawyer's lies. You made all this up to steal everything back." Helen let out a quiet laugh, dry, cold. Call me mother one last time, Lila. After today, you won't have that right anymore. Ryan stepped out onto the porch, the rain matting his hair against his forehead. You destroyed my family, he said, his voice low, shaking. You destroyed my father. You tried to destroy my mother. You don't get to call anyone in this house anything ever again. Lila spun toward him, fury flashing through her tears. You think she's innocent? She set this up. She made your father lose everything. I only loved him. Helen didn't move. Her voice was quiet but firm, slicing through the rain. If your love needs forged signatures and life insurance policies, then it isn't love, Lila. It's conspiracy. The storm deepened. Thunder rolled above the old oak tree, the same one that had once shaded their 10th anniversary picnic. Now it loomed like a silent witness to their reckoning. Robert stood motionless, rainwater dripping from his hair. Helen, he rasped. I'm sorry. I didn't know what she was doing. I just wanted a new beginning. I was wrong. Helen looked at him for a long time. Her eyes held no anger, no affection, only a sorrow so deep it seemed carved from stone. You weren't just wrong, Robert. You were weak. And your weakness opened the door for evil to walk into our home. Lila laughed, suddenly high, cracked, desperate. You're all liars. I'm the only one who loved honestly. She lunged toward the steps, trying to push past the officers. One of them stepped forward, blocking her path. Miss Grant, he said evenly, please stand back. You're under restriction. Don't make this worse. Lila twisted in his grip, her sobs mixing with the rain. No, this is my house. I fought for this. Helen took a single step forward. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the storm like a bell. No, Lila, this was never your house. It was built on loyalty, and you never laid a single honest brick in it. The words struck like steel. Lila froze, her lips trembling, her defiance draining away as the rain washed down her face, erasing the last trace of victory. Robert stood beside her, head bowed, mumbling something too soft to hear. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed red. I've lost everything, haven't I? Helen's reply was barely a whisper. Not because of me, because you chose the one who would pull you under. A crack of thunder split the sky, echoing through the garden. The officers moved forward. One gestured for Robert and Lila to follow. The black car door opened with a click. Lila turned once, her eyes full of hatred and despair. Helen didn't answer the look. She stood still in the rain, her dark coat soaked, hair clinging to her neck, but in her eyes, for the first time in months, there was light. Not the light of victory, the light of cleansing. When the car pulled away, Ryan walked up and wrapped his arms around his mother. He didn't speak, only held her tightly, trembling. Marissa stood nearby, tears mixing with rain. Helen placed a hand on her son's back. Her voice was soft, warm against the storm. It's over now, darling. Every storm must break. Ryan's voice cracked. Mom, did you really forgive them? She shook her head slowly. Forgiveness isn't necessary. It's enough to make sure they can't hurt anyone anymore. Lightning flashed, illuminating the garden. The oak tree, the roses, the stone path all gleamed under the cleansing rain. Helen lifted her face to the sky, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The thunder that followed no longer sounded like wrath. It sounded like release. And in that downpour, her voice rose softly, steady as truth itself. The scream is not of pain. This time, it's the sound of chains breaking, for all of us. The storm passed. The air smelled of wet soil and roses. Water pooled across the courtyard, shimmering in the fading light. Helen stood there for a moment, taking in the scene: her home, her garden, her peace restored. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of renewal. It felt like a benediction, and in that dim, amber twilight, The woman who had once collapsed on a kitchen floor finally smiled, not with triumph, but with the quiet grace of someone who had reclaimed her soul. Spring came early to Ashford that year. Sunlight spilled through the windows, laying ribbons of gold across the wooden floor. The old Archer house, once haunted by betrayal, now breathed peace, as though every corner had exhaled at last. On the kitchen table, a vase of white tulips stood in bloom, their scent faint and clean. Helen placed a freshly baked apple pie on the cooling rack. Her hands no longer trembled. 6 months had passed since the storm, and somehow, life in its quiet wisdom had written itself anew. The front door opened. Ryan stepped in, sunlight and wind following him. His face looked younger now, his eyes bright again. "Mom," he said, smiling, "Marissa sends her apologies. She's on a call with a new sponsor for the Safe Haven project." Helen returned the smile. "We should be thanking her. If it weren't for Marissa, none of us would still be standing." Ryan moved beside her, helping to set the table. The light caught his eyes, not just the brightness of morning, but the kind born of clarity. "You know," he said quietly, "I think Dad taught me something strange. That love isn't about holding on to someone, it's about learning not to become them." Helen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her smile tender yet knowing. "You've learned in months what it took me a lifetime to understand. When people leave you, that's when you learn how to become yourself." That afternoon, Helen drove to the riverfront district. The brick building rose 4 stories high, its windows glowing with light. It was once the consolation apartment she'd received in the divorce settlement, a symbol of what was lost. Today, the sign by the door bore a new name, the Whitaker Haven, a place to begin again. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint and chamomile tea. Women sat talking softly near the windows. Children played with wooden toys in a corner. The walls were warm with laughter, the sound of small lives rebuilding. A young woman with short hair approached, shaking Helen's hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Archer. Without your funding, we wouldn't have a home." Helen smiled. "It isn't funding, dear. It's just me sharing a bit of peace I was lucky enough to find." She walked down the hallway, her steps echoing gently against the new floors, and stopped before a framed photograph in the central lobby, a black and white image of the old oak tree in Ashford. Beneath it, an inscription read, "From what falls apart, we rebuild with dignity." Helen stood there for a long time. Light streamed through the tall windows, brushing her face. Time had traced soft lines around her eyes, but those eyes themselves were changed bright, steady, full of calm. That evening, the Archer house glowed with laughter again. Ryan and Marissa arrived carrying a basket of purple tulips. They had just gotten engaged. The 3 of them gathered around the table, simple food, soft music, the warmth of belonging. "I think you should speak at the center's opening ceremony," Marissa said, her eyes shining. "You're living proof that no woman can be defeated once she understands her own worth." Helen laughed softly. "A speech? I've been giving one my whole life, only in silence." Ryan lifted his glass. "Then here's to silence, and to everything it teaches us." Their glasses touched with a gentle chime, a sound that lingered in the air like music. Outside, the spring breeze stirred the rose petals. The old oak tree bent its shadow across the porch. Helen looked around the table at her son, at the woman who had saved her family from ruin, at the humble meal glowing under the warm light. Everything that had once shattered was here again, not perfect, but true. Later that night, Helen stepped out onto the porch, a cup of mint tea in hand. The wind from the river was cool and smelled of damp earth. Above her, the oak tree swayed softly. The same tree that had witnessed love, betrayal, and rebirth. Under the moonlight, its leaves shimmered like silver. She spoke into the night, her voice gentle, meant for no one in particular. "You wanted to break me, but you never realized you were laying the foundation for the home I would one day build for others." A breeze passed through, scattering a few rose petals across the steps. Helen smiled, a smile no longer edged with bitterness, but full of quiet warmth. She turned and went back inside, closing the door behind her. From within came the sound of laughter, Ryan and Marissa's voices weaving with the soft clinking of dishes. Outside, the night settled over Ashford still, peaceful, tender in its beauty. Helen Archer, the woman who had once collapsed on a cold kitchen floor, now stood as the keeper of light. And within the walls where every storm had once raged, a new dawn was beginning to rise. After betrayal, would you close your heart forever or use your wounds to light the way for someone else? Comment 7 if you believe healing means sharing love. Comment 8 if you believe peace begins when you learn to live for yourself.